I want to start with a little zikr in Hebrew. The phrase is El Chai V'Kayam. El Chai V'Kayam. Okay? El Chai V'Kayam. El Chai V'Kayam. It means God living eternal. God living and eternal. In Arabic we say Ya Chai, Ya Qayyum. Almost exactly parallel. But let's stick with the Hebrew. El Chai V'Kayam. 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 El It's taught in the Jewish tradition that before we were born, an oath is administered to us by an angel. And the angel says to us, "Be righteous and be not wicked." But even if the whole world tells you that you're righteous, you are not to regard yourself as righteous, but as wicked. And we're asked to agree to this before we're allowed to pass into this world. And apparently we all do, and then we all break our oath. But be righteous and be not wicked. But even if the whole world tells you that you are righteous, then you're still to regard yourself as if you were wicked. On the other hand, the Jewish tradition also says, do not regard yourself as if you were wicked. Because a person who is ever regarding themselves as if they're wicked is often heartsick and depressed, and therefore can't serve God fully with a joyful heart. So what are we to do? How do we know if we're righteous or wicked? How are we to come to an understanding of what is righteous and what is wicked? In the medieval texts, they came up with a system of 5 classifications or 5 types of people that exist in the world. And the 5 are these: the righteous who prosper, the righteous who suffer, the wicked who prosper, the wicked who suffer, and those who are in between. Neither very righteous nor very wicked. And on the one hand, it was meant to address the question of why do good people suffer and why do bad people prosper? And the answer that was come up with was basically this: that the righteous who prosper are complete tzaddikim, completely righteous people. And they are the ones whose actions are entirely righteous all the time. In thought, word, and deed, they are behaving righteously. And therefore, since the totality of their thoughts, words, and deeds are righteous, they are perfect tzaddikim, perfectly righteous, and prosper in this world. Then you have the righteous who suffer. And the righteous who suffer are incomplete tzaddikim, not completely righteous people. And so the majority of their actions and thoughts and words are righteous, but they still fall into error, into sin and thoughts of sin and negativity, and therefore they suffer. Then you have, on the other end of the spectrum, the wicked who prosper. And the wicked who prosper, as you might expect, a good proportion, or the better proportion of their deeds are negative and evil or wicked, and the smaller proportion good. And therefore the wicked who prosper, they prosper because every once in a while they do a good thing and they benefit by it. Then on the furthest end of that spectrum, you have the wicked who suffer. And these are people whose deeds are all day, every day, 24/7, wicked. They never come out of that mode. And again, in between, we have the people that are called the beinoni, the in-betweeners. About half their deeds are righteous, the other half their deeds wicked. Any flaws in the system?
Yeah.
Well, I actually had a question. When you say prosper,
Mm-hmm.
how are you using that term?
The way they meant it was that they tended to benefit materially in the world. Somehow they seemed to do well in the world. So you had the righteous who did well in the world, and you had the wicked who did well in the world. But does the system answer the question of, you know, why bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people? And are there any flaws in this classification system?
Oh, it's completely flawed. From beginning to end. Perhaps a better one would be what Hazrat Khan said, that we have to learn to welcome pain and suffering.
Welcome pain and suffering. So taking an attitude toward the things that happen to us. And this system doesn't account for that. What other flaws with the system?
Well, it creates a victim blaming. It's like if you are not doing good, then you're wicked. Or either you're wicked or you just do wicked things. Which doesn't really address the personality and anything like that. And then also, how can you have that? On one side, you have the wicked that prosper, and they don't do as much good sense as the
righteous who
the
suffer.
righteous who suffer. That just doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
Then there's that fifth category, which is probably everybody, and you can either prosper or not, which means there's no.
Yeah, if your deeds were equally wicked and righteous, pretty much nothing happens to you.
Prosper, you have to be completely perfect, or do more bad things than good.
Yeah.
That's also right that I know.
It's just less work to be the wicked who prosper.
Right.
But why do you tell this story? Do you prosper as a result?
You can
Well,
tell it makes them
Which
thirsty.
technically,
Right now I'm the wicked who prosper. Well, even as this teaching is given in the Talmud, in this compendium of Jewish culture and law and metaphor, even as this is taught, then one master in the tradition, Rabbah is his name, which means like master, says, and for example, I'm a beinoni, an in-betweener, meaning that his deeds were roughly equally wicked and equally righteous. But then, this master, Rabbah, was known for never even slipping in word into negativity. And so his nephew, another great master, says, Master, you don't even make it possible for us to live. If you're a beinoni, if you're an in-betweener, then what are we? Who don't even live up to your ideal, don't even come close. We're liable to the death penalty if you're only an in-betweener. You're not even righteous. You know, we should be killed for our sins. So, the Jewish tradition is not so unsophisticated as it's making it sound. It's setting up a system that we're going to question, because lots of people make this assumption, or at least they did. In lots of the medieval systems, it seemed to be a tally system. The more good deeds you did, it was expected that you would prosper. It's never the case. But the theology was set up this way, though, so that it seemed as if you pile up good deeds, it'll all work out for you. And yet it never did. And then, right on the end of this teaching, where they give this classification system, one of the greatest masters of the time says, I'm an in-betweener, I'm not righteous. And everybody else says, what are we then? So a later master in the Jewish tradition, a Hasidic master named Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was the founder of my teacher's lineage of Hasidism, he says, it cannot be the case that it's a tally system of good and bad deeds that make for righteousness and evil or wickedness. This doesn't make any sense. And that system doesn't actually account for the intentions behind actions. So, because I can do something, I can give to charity, and that can appear like a righteous act, but I did it perhaps in the sight of this whole group so that everybody could see me putting $1 in the donation bowl, so that I could, inflate my own ego. So, is that a righteous act? The system doesn't even account for that. It's just looking for material acts that look like good deeds, and if you pile them up, you're righteous. And whether a person is righteous or not is based upon the aggregate of their good deed total at any given moment that you look at them. When I'm 20, what's my tally? When I'm 40, what's my tally? When I'm 60, did it go down? It's kind of silly. So, another system of 5 categories is proposed by this Hasidic master, Reb Shneur Zalman. And he says, yes, the 5 categories are these. The tzaddik gamur, the completely righteous person. Then you have the tzaddik she'eno gamur, the conditionally righteous person. Then you have the rasha she'eno gamur, the conditionally wicked person. And then finally, the rasha gamur, the completely wicked person. And in between again, you have the beinoni. But he defines things differently. Now he says, the completely righteous person, the tzaddik gamur, is a person who in their actions and in their thought life and in their intentions exists on one end of the spectrum. And the spectrum is this, that we have within us within us 2 poles. Above us, we have compelling us a divine soul, nefesh Elohit, nefesh ha-Elohit, the divine soul. And then below us, as it were, is a soul called the animal soul, the nefesh ha-Bahamit. And that has a compelling nature also that's pulling us toward it. And we live between these 2 poles, between a divine nature and an animal nature. And they're both have a magnetic pull on us, and we just keep moving back and forth between them. Both are compelling us, but we tend to live on one end of the spectrum, the animal end. And we tend to live on the animal end because the divine end tends to be immaterial, transcendent, ephemeral, and the animal end is very material and dense and has the kind of a gravity pull to it. And being in bodies, it's much easier for us to lean into our animal nature than our divine nature. And yet, both whisper to us equally. It's just that the habits of the body tend toward the animal all the time. So, he tells us that the completely righteous person is never even tempted, even in the slightest, or compelled in the slightest, by the pull of the animal soul to fall into negativity, into negative behavior. Not even in their deepest unconscious is there even anything that's compelling them to act in a negative way. There's not even a whisper. The conditionally righteous person, the tzaddik she'eino gamur, hears the whispers of negativity that come from the animal soul. But they're not actually very tempted to follow those whispers. And so their actions are completely righteous, and it's fairly easy for them. Not much difficulty around how they're going to behave. On the other end, the conditionally wicked person, they hear the whispers of the divine soul, but don't tend to act on them. And in action, tend toward the wicked. It's just that when the divine soul speaks, they just tend to ignore it. And then the absolutely wicked, the Rasha Gamur, is completely opaque to the whispers of the divine. They hear none of it. They're completely wicked. You know, this is Voldemort. You know? This is the Dark Lord of the Sick. The divine nature in them has been eradicated. Then he proposes a new definition for the beinoni, the in-betweener. This is no longer the average person whose deeds are equally righteous and wicked. He says the beinoni is someone who feels strongly compelled by the voice of the animal nature and a tendency toward wickedness, but in action never succumbs. In inaction, they never succumb. So, looking at them externally, there is no external difference that you can see between the absolutely righteous person, the conditionally righteous person, and the beinoni, the in-betweener. Because in action, they act righteously. It's only internally that shows how compelled they feel by the animal soul and the animal nature. Yes?
But wouldn't that make the in-betweener much more stronger and evolved than someone who's really righteous, like in this definition? Because it's easy to maybe not be tempted, but it's so much harder to actually resist your urges.
Now I don't have to point out the flaw in the system, because she just did. There's a character in Charles Dickens' Bleak House, wonderful character, Tom something, I can't remember. And Tom is just this wonderfully good-natured guy. And I think he works in a tavern, and whatever somebody asks, he does it, with this wonderful spirit, and runs off to do it, and is just so genial and good-natured, and doesn't seem like anything can get him down. And the hardest work, nothing. But he's constantly disappointed. Because he thinks, whatever the hard job he does, and whoever the difficult personality is that he deals with, he keeps thinking, there's just no merit in my actions because it's just so easy to be genial. It's his nature to be very genial. And so he can find no merit in anything that he does. And so eventually he runs off with a character in the book to America, which is seen as the backwater at the time. It was, you know, in that novel, it's all conceived like swamplands, you know, and just full of flies, and he's just gung-ho to go off to America so that he can finally get some merit out of his good nature, you know, to be challenged. As, you know, what merit is there in being the completely righteous person who's never even tempted? How hard is that? I mean, it's described as it's easy for them. There's no real temptation.
But that person doesn't exist.
Yes. That person is no more realistic on that end of the spectrum than the Rasha Gamur, the absolutely wicked person. Who is this? Voldemort. We create these characters, but even the worst characters that we can think of in history, they're not born evil.
Darth Vader.
Yeah, Darth Vader, he turns it around. He's a more realistic character. So,
Even Voldemort loved his snake.
yes, even Voldemort loved his He had an investment in the snake because part of his soul was located in the snake. So, it's an interesting problem, and the question is, what was he trying to suggest by improving the system this way? I mean, there is a clear improvement because now it's focused on intentionality behind actions. And when this particular master, Reb Shneur Zalman, who comes up with this system, is asked, what are you? Are you a tzaddik? And he says, no, I'm a beinoni. He's an in-betweener, meaning that he struggles all the time. But in action, he doesn't fall into sin.
There's another puzzle. This way seems to harshly classify those of us who occasionally succumb.
More than occasionally. So, you know, all of his future descendants and followers, they of course classify him as a tzaddik, but he classified himself as a beinoni, an in-betweener. But even this, it seems unattainable for us. So we even the best of us end up being what my teacher called Rishayim in recovery, wicked people in recovery. You know, we're like it's like we're in AA all the time. We've fallen into wickedness, and we're just trying to get back to righteousness. So the real question is this meant to be a static system? That there are people in the world who are completely righteous, feel no temptation, and therefore, in this system also, create no karma. Their actions have no negative karma, no negative reciprocal effects, because in intentionality, they have no conflict whatsoever, purely righteous. So you see how this goes back to a similarity to the earlier system, the righteous who prosper, the righteous who suffer. Those who do feel some pull from the negative end, they do create some karma because they're struggling with negative thoughts. And so negative reciprocal effects flow into their lives, etc. But again, the question is this a static system? Are there people that are completely righteous, conditionally righteous, beinoni, conditionally wicked, purely wicked? And a lot of the system is taught this way. But when you look closely at it, there seems to be a more subtle level. And the more subtle level requires different terminology, I think. So we have the original 5, the secondary 5, and now I'll give you a third layer of 5 categories. At the place where we had the people that we were considering absolutely righteous or completely righteous, we had a category that we call luminous transparency. Then for the conditionally righteous, we have relative transparency. For the beinonim, the in-betweeners, we have translucence. Then, for the conditionally wicked, we have relative opacity. And then for the completely wicked, instead we have absolute opacity. So, at the upper level, light can pass through unimpeded in any way, so that whatever this, if we imagine it as glass, it just seems completely filled with light. It's just luminescent itself, because there's no obstruction to the light whatsoever. Where we would have the conditionally righteous, there's a little obstruction, but it still works out to be pretty much transparency to us. Translucence, it's meaning there's some bending in it. There's a little warping, but light passes through in a very good way. Relative opacity is it's really getting on the dark end, but a little light is passing through. And then complete opacity, there's no light passing through. Now, the way this works is that it's no longer about whether we are identified as completely righteous people, or as in-betweeners, or as completely wicked. This system works on the idea that we have moments, in any given moment. Let me qualify that a little more. In any given moment where we need to make a decision, we experience one of these 5 states. Some moments of decision, it is absolutely clear what we must do, and we don't even hesitate doing that. This is the right thing to do. We feel absolutely clear. And that we would call, luminous transparency. And those moments in our lives, on the spiritual path, when they happen, they feel like pure grace. You know exactly what to do when you do it. Then there are the moments that we call relative transparency, where it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear, and so you may have some reservation back here, a little bit behind you, but you feel pretty strong about what you're doing, and you're going to do it. There are moments that are dark, and there's just a little window in them of light that gives us a little guidance in what to do. And that's the relative opacity. And we don't know whether we're doing the right thing or not even close. And then there are moments where we're in complete darkness. We have no idea whatsoever what to do. And we're cut off from the light so that we pretty much act according to the dark. And then most of life falls somewhere in the middle. Translucence. There's light and there's darkness. And in us we need to make a decision. Now this takes us back to those 2 poles within us, between our divine nature and our animal nature. And we are neither angels nor animals. And it's not for us to be angels or animals. And therefore we have something uniquely human that is called the nefesh hasiklit, which is the rational soul. And it's the fulcrum of our consciousness. And we never know which way it's going to go because it's merely a tool. It depends on how we use it. So, in a given moment, we're feeling the pull of our animal nature and the pull of our divine nature, and they're sending us different messages. The animal wants to eat. It wants the body to be full, you know. There's nothing wrong with it. The divine says, you should learn to abstain. You should learn delayed gratification so that you know that you're not just a body. You also have an angelic nature. You also have a divine nature. And how are you ever going to experience it if you're just dull from overindulgence in food? Now, the nefesh hasiklit, the rational soul, argues. So, if I'm going on a diet, bad example, I'm skinny enough. However, I have a sugar addiction. I have a major sugar addiction. So, it's me sitting at my little table, you know, in my apartment in Alim, and I'm faced with the apple pie, half eaten. And I'm thinking, just one more piece. And my rationalizing mind can say, apple pie, it's practically apples. It's practically health food. More apples, more better, right? We do this, you know, we rationalize. I mean, it's a ridiculous example. It's one that I might make. And so, the rational nature can also rationalize. And if it's feeling the pull from my animal nature, and it can tend toward it and rationalize according to that pull. To feed my emotions, I may want more of that sense of fullness from food, you know, I may want the, you know, that charge from the sugar in it, etc. And that's all coming from my animal nature. On the other hand, I can use my rational nature, my rational faculty, to say to myself, Netanel, you know how this is going to turn out. It's half eaten already, you're already full, you're going to have another piece, it's going to turn into another piece, and pretty soon it's gone and you've eaten the whole thing. And that's not just apples, that's 2 cups of sugar. You know how this is going to turn out. And you know how you're going to feel afterwards. Isn't it enough already? And you know very well from experience that anything that you overindulge in, it deadens the joy and the experience of it. You're not going to experience more joy from another piece of pie. You've had as much joy as you're going to get from it. Now you're just going to keep eating, trying to get the same result out of it, and you won't get the same result out of it anymore. So I can have this talk with myself and finally push it away. Not that that often happens. I was just confessing to Pedro about the whole box of cookies I ate the other night. So my rationalizing, you know, won out. So the question is, how do we use that tool, that very human tool, to live between our two natures? And I want to point out again that though the animal soul gets equated with negativity, it is not in itself negative at all. It is merely animal. And though the divine nature, the divine soul, gets equated with all that is good and positive, it is not necessarily for us at all to become angels. We're not that. We are something between animal and angel, between divine and fully material. And we feel the pull of each. Now, if we look at the example of a lion on the savannah, and the lion kills a gazelle, do we think of a lion as evil or wicked? It's a lion. It's how it eats. But if a lion kills a gazelle, or even if a lion attacks another lion, we don't think them wicked. We think them operating according to the laws of nature in which they operate. However, we do think it wicked for one of us to attack another person, to strike out, lash out at them merely because they've invaded our space. So the rules that we have for lions are not the rules that we have for ourselves. We are not lions. We are not operating according to an exclusively animal nature. We have a rational faculty, and we have a pull from a transcendent end, the divine nature. And we have to live in the middle. But we don't say the animal is bad. It just compels us in a way that is troublesome. You know, we have drives in us to acquire food, to acquire mates, to procreate, and they're inconvenient. They drive us and cajole us in times, you know, if I'm a 30-something-year-old woman and I'm starting to try to get my career going, and then I start to feel this pull in my body that's saying, have a child, have a child, have a child. And you're saying, it's remarkably inconvenient, but you cannot ignore it. It's pushing you, it's cajoling you. And this is what drives us crazy as human beings. Because we think it's all psychology, but there's just drives coming from the body that we have to learn to live with and work with. And a lot of the difficulties we have are just trying to accommodate those drives. So it's living between the divine soul and the animal soul, and also understanding, unlike the systems of the past, the spiritual systems of the past that told us that everything that is material is bad, everything that is immaterial is good, and you want to, mortify the flesh, kill the flesh, and release the spirit. That belonged to an ascetic period. We don't accept that anymore. Our job is not to become angels, but to find what it is to be fully human, remarkably human, to live between these two poles, and to live in a way that feels whole and healthy. Now, we run into lots of problems of definition in spirituality when we look around and we judge who's spiritual and who's not, and who's a better practitioner than another, and which guru has attained, greater, levels of enlightenment, etc. Who's realized and who's not. All this crap we get into. And here's where I think the system of looking at openness, transparency, and translucence, and relative opacity are more helpful. And they run together with the concepts of hal and maqam in Sufism, or ahwal and maqamat, states and stations. And there's really good definitions around states and stations in the Sufi tradition that are very healthy for understanding the things that happen on the spiritual path. States, ahwal, are they could be as simple as moods. You know, a mood is passing through you where you're happy. You feel buoyant. Another mood is sad, a little depressed. You know, joyous laughter and the feelings that come with that. These are all states. But also, when you're into a particular meditation and you experience something ecstatic or illuminating, still states. It's like, you know, on a radar, there's a blip. It goes up, it goes back down, or a heartbeat on, you know, on a monitor. Blip, goes up. That's your ecstatic experience. You know, your great realization in this meditation, you know, during a retreat that you're sure is going to change your life. Those epiphanies that we have, after which we're sure we're going to be different. A week later, same old person who had an epiphany. It's a state.
Aren't you wants to say that's overly simplistic?
Sure. I'm getting to that.
Okay.
We're an impatient group.
It's good, it's good. Makes me do less work. Come up with the questions yourself. You should. So what then are stations? A maqam, a station, is are levels of sustained integration, what we might call maturity. We see over the arc of a life that a person tends to mature, some more than others, but a person tends to mature through their experiences. And more blips of this sort can create a critical mass that up-levels us in maturity, according to the teachings. So more and more experiences of a certain type tend to lend themselves toward a maturation. And after a certain period of time, it's said that this becomes a station. Does that mean that the person doesn't fall? I don't think so. It just means that when you reach a certain level of maturity, you don't tend to fall much below it. It doesn't mean that you don't fall. I tend to think of this like you've climbed a ladder up onto a platform. Once on that platform, let's imagine it's fairly large, I can jump. I can leap into the air from this platform and attain a greater height, and then I'll tend to come back down and land on the platform because that's my base. At the same time, I can be walking around on the platform and stumble over something and fall down. So in each case, I've both risen above and I've fallen down, whereas I was standing on it before. But people don't, when they reach levels of maturity, they don't tend to fall much below them. It seems to be their base. Not to say that they can't, but there's a tendency to reach a certain level and to hold at it. And then there's a process again of reaching a critical mass from there that up-levels us. So in both traditions, what they tend to do with these kinds of teachings that I'm outlining here is to say that the more we tend to operate according to the light that's passing through us, you know, working with the very difficult tension between the two natures, if we stay in that tension, you know, and don't do one of two things, try to exit the tension by either just giving into the animal nature, which makes us animal and wicked for human beings. It wouldn't be wicked for an animal, but for us, to give into the animal nature exclusively would be wicked. Or to just try to bypass our animal nature and say, I only do what is good, and try to identify only with that. Both of them are bypassing the tension, trying to get out of the tension. But if we stay in the tension, what tension between two opposing poles tends to do to us is grow us, grows our capacity. We're being stretched by remaining in the tension. And after a while, this stretching goes back and forth, and pretty soon, we're larger and have more capacity. And what's taught in these traditions around, you know, these processes is that when we do that, when we have more capacity, we have more moments that tend to be like relative transparency or luminous transparency, more moments of grace. And this, for instance, is what you know, Hazrat Inayati-Maimuni will describe around intuition. We talked about this in another one of the talks about how does one know whether one's intuition is correct? And he basically says there's no trick. There's no trick. You just have to follow it when you think you're having it, and you get into a relationship with it where you over time attune to the characteristics that truly characterize an intuition as opposed to a random thought. It's so difficult for us to tell the difference that all we can do is follow them and learn from them. And over time, we have more and more of them. If you get into a true relationship with your intuition, it happens more and it becomes clearer. And that is like the luminous transparency. A funny anecdote is coming to my head. I don't know, it's funny, but it's a Hasidic story about this Hasidic master, the Kotzker Rebbe, was, when he was a young man, he was walking down the streets of this village, and they were passing the house of a non-Jewish man who hated Jews and had trained his dog to attack Jews whenever they came by. And so they're walking by this house, and this large dog comes out, ferocious, and comes running at them. And the Kotzker Rebbe is walking with his friends, and his friends turn tail and run. And he stays standing there. And his friends look back, terrified for him, and they see the dog come running up and stop. Just, you know, I imagine it skids to a stop right in front of him. And he stares at the dog. The dog stares at him. And then it turns and whimpers and runs off. The friends come back and say, "We thought you were dead. What happened?" And he said, "It suddenly occurred to me. I wondered, does my inner dog, do I have my inner dog in the service of God?" And so I took a moment to make sure that it was. And when it was, the dog that was in front of me recognized it and realized there was no enemy. walked off. And in fact, that I was a greater dog than he was. I was the big dog because I had mastery of my dog nature. I like that story. I wonder if it's true. I think about that, you know, when I was trying to train my untrainable beagle. I read a book on dog training. It was called The Dog Listener.
Oh, yeah.
And this was a great book, and I learned a lot from it.
The beagle didn't learn anything.
The beagle didn't learn anything.
The beagle end up training you.
Well, I learned how to deal with him. But what the book taught me was amazing. You know, I had often heard these, you hear these stories how the founder of the Hasidic tradition, the Baal Shem Tov, the holy Baal Shem Tov, knew the language of the birds and the animals, they always said. And people always imagined that means that he could speak the language of birds. And, you know, he knew how to whistle in a certain way, and he knew what grunt to make for thus and such animal. And as I was reading this book, The Dog Listener, it was fascinating because she was suggesting in it, she says, no, dogs have a language by which they communicate. And she, by studying wolf packs, learned that there were certain postures to take, certain attitudes to take, internal attitudes that you could take that would shift how your dog behaved around you. And you were never, ever to give in to them. And I did find that I could take a certain posture, and it had to be accompanied by a certain attitude inside that would adjust my dog around me. The real difficulty was being 100% consistent in that behavior, because you want to slack up all the time.
Mershon says that about raising children. Education, same thing. He says we should conduct them all day with our eyes.
Yep. And difficult, because it's asking us to play a role that's necessary for the need of the situation and the need of the person around you, and we just want to be ourselves, and we don't want to be that disciplined. But there are needs that require you to shift your behavior. And I also found that when I had to do this, it actually had to shift me into the noblest aspects of my nature. The part of me that was proud, and not in a negative sense, but was full in my own being, that, you know, my chest would rise and my shoulders were back and I was noble in my bearing, and my dog recognized it and therefore would sit down in front of me. It's hard to maintain, but it was fascinating. And so, you know, in a very real sense, I'd found my inner dog, but not in a lesser sense, but in a very noble animal nature sense. You know, there's an innate natural being that is full of its own nature. And being able to shift into that consciously was extremely human.
But was it transparent?
I don't think it was transparent, no.
Maybe a step towards transparency?
I think it is a step towards transparency, because you're engaging consciousness. You're in the tension that is growing you, and you're being conscious on purpose,
More present.
more present, and present on purpose, because I knew I had to be present to actually get what I needed from my dog, to use this example.
I found that dog treats do that also.
Bribery also. But I still find that the bribery made me conditionally wicked At least the slave of my dog.
Yes,
Did
it's
you
true.
ever consider that the dyslexic dog is God, and that you were approaching your inner God instead of your inner dog?
It kind of worked out that way.
Yeah.
In finding the nobility of I would always think of it as my wolf nature. And I would go to because I had to make a mind move that accompanied the posture, I had to do something that would be effective in terms of my intentionality and my internal consciousness. And so you have to come up with an image that will actually shift you. And that image has to be compelling. And so for me, I couldn't be another beagle, another 12-inch beagle. I had to achieve a larger dog or a more noble presence as I saw it, and for me, that was a very large wolf. And almost I had to engage it as some sort of totem inside that would help me make that mind move or that shift that would then be effective for the situation. And it's not just dog training, it's giving a talk like this. You have to make certain mind moves that pull you into a state where you say, the need of this moment is more important than my fear of this moment. And because I was a person with a remarkable level of anxiety around public speaking or public attention, or all of my life, I had to find those internal images that would allow me to do this, to overcome the panic attacks that would come. And I would do different things at different times. And once I actually remembered being a boxing fan. I know some people will be appalled, but I am what I am. Like Popeye. Being a boxing fan, I remembered something that Mike Tyson would say about approaching the ring. Now, this is a fighter who was just fearsome. I mean, he terrified his opponents. He won the fight before he entered the ring because he so intimidated his opponents, and it makes your job a whole lot easier if you won the fight before you've entered the ring. But he said that before he walked out, he had a remarkable amount of fear. But with every step, he would tell himself, he would talk to himself into a confidence where he said, I have a power in me. I have a power in me. It's going to manifest. And with every step, he saw it as growing and building, so that by the time he entered the ring, he was absolute confidence. And it was so magnetic that even his opponent, who had not cultivated the same kind of magnetism, could not resist it. And so I would take that, and every step I walked toward the room where I was going to give a talk would build that sort of magnetism. And I would use the image of Mike Tyson, whatever was going to be effective for me, And that exists for me, that existed then on the animal end of that spectrum. I needed to build a body confidence because a lot of my lack of confidence was a lot of lack of body confidence. So I needed to build some confidence in the body, drawing on the animal nature to find nobility, to serve the situation. So I don't want to characterize the animal as negative, even though it does, and most of these discussions get characterized that way.
I have two questions.
Right. The Christians, or the Catholics really, they solved it by indulgences. That, if you had indulgences, you were forgiven. And it's like, okay, you have a path to heaven or whatever. That doesn't play in this at all. Then there's the idiot that has no consciousness. A good example would be Don Quixote. What did he accomplish? He's jousting with these windmills, and it's like the whole world is upside down. And I know some people, like, too. It's like there's no reality there, and they're just fooling themselves and fooling everybody around them, getting by fooling everybody. And I mean, a lot of it is from their upbringing or their circumstance. So that really doesn't play in this at all. There's no consciousness.
Well, some of that shows a paradigmatic shift over time in terms of consciousness. Whereas, you know, in the medieval period where you could still buy indulgences, that was participating in what was then a mass belief system that good deeds equated to righteousness, that you could pile them up. Though I'd say it was participating in that consciousness, it was taking advantage of the fact that many, many people believed that. And yet, in the period in which we see that, we also find a group of people at the, you know, the higher end meaning in the hierarchical scale within the church, clearly taking advantage of this belief that people could buy indulgences, therefore to finance, you know, papal wars and papal buildings, which are quite beautiful.
The Crusades.
And to finance the Crusades, to finance the building of these magnificent cathedrals that we see. A lot of those were built on penances. People believing that they had to pay penances to support such things, and that they could buy their way out of those things. That was a certain kind of consciousness. But it was not very long before you get somebody like Martin Luther who's saying, this is just a corruption. Intentionality is more important, and that becomes the basis of the reform.
So how about karma yoga? That's another working off, you know, your karma by good deeds, actually.
But the basis of karma yoga is that to do an action in service without attachment to the result. So if there's attachment to the result, that this is going to clean up my karma,
You're just adding more karma.
it doesn't clean up your karma. That's the trick of it. It's the perfect situation. The only way to clean up your karma is to do it without desire for the result of cleaning up the karma. So it's like, to go back to Harry Potter again, Dumbledore's wonderful solution to Voldemort not getting the Philosopher's Stone. Only a person who didn't want it to use it could get it.
The question comes to mind thinking about the animal soul. I was at a Rosh Hashanah service recently, and there was a teaching of Reb Zalman's that caught my attention. My paraphrase is, watch out, if you give into your cravings, your God sense will be obscured. And I think we all recognize that conventional wisdom, psychologically, spiritually, empirically. But I'm wondering from the standpoint of this theology and microcosmology, how, there seems to be a mystery there, something to understand about, why does, or how does giving into cravings obscure one's God sense?
That's why I was putting the emphasis on the moment of decision. The moment of decision is so important. Critical moments of decision when you're going to decide between one act and another. Between apple pie or no apple pie, after I've had one piece. Do I have the second piece? And the consequence of having the second piece is one, a diminished resolve in the future. Once I give in to having the second piece, I'm running a rut in consciousness that slips into that behavior easier and easier.
This is sort of a classical karmic dimension.
So it's running the rut. And you know, which way are you going to create a rut, you know? Also, if I do delay the gratification, I also build up a certain power around the ability to do that. And so the Mersha talks about this a lot in terms of what is the value of certain kinds of ascetic practices in the past. And so, you know, staring at a certain, you know, point on the wall, or actually doing fasts, and so on. The value is to learn mastery, to build up the capacity to do that. Not that we need to starve ourselves in the world and just become ascetics, but to achieve enough mastery so that when we need it, we have it. We can draw on that power to abstain from the thing, you know, that will not be necessarily helpful for us.
I always wonder, is the opposite possible? Is it possible once you've built up a certain amount of mastery to begin to lose it by giving in? Do we lose willpower when we don't exert mastery?
Yeah, I wonder, see, you know, this goes back to that question of like maturity. You know, I think everybody, you know, as you mature over time, everybody has ups and downs within that mature level that they've reached. Within that maqam, they're going to have ups and downs. It's the human experience. What is going to take you down a level in terms of maturity? What is going to, you're actually going to go down a maqam. What would it take? And I think that's what it would take. Stepping out of the tension. I think we can't afford to step out of the tension as human beings. So if I, like, there's nothing wrong with having a piece of pie. But there's a point for me where it's going to become overindulgence. It may not be the same point for somebody else, but there is a point for me, and I believe there's a me that knows where that line is, and it speaks to me. And I think every one of us has that voice where it speaks to us, and we know, and then we cross it or we don't. And I think it's possible for a person, even for a person who's achieved a significant level of maturity, if they get into the place of believing that that level of maturity that they've reached is absolute, it's a setup for dropping a level.
But there is also the possibility that if you look at these as tests, and once you've mastered that particular problem, then you move on. And if the test comes again, it's not a problem. So,
Or it's harder.
or it's harder.
Or it reaches a little more subtle
harder,
level.
but it wouldn't be the same test, would it?
Could be.
No.
You think
Well, I think it would be different. Like, I think your consciousness level will be different, and so you may deal with it differently. It would be the same test.
that's the hope.
Yeah, that's the hope.
That's the hope, yeah.
And sometimes we're choosing between two positives, but we set a strike balance. For instance, I find in living at the abode, my capacity to enjoy beingness just by sitting and performing one of the salute practices of doing nothing, not even meditating for 30 minutes, is becoming easier and easier. Well, how good for me. At the same time, I have to earn a living. And I find my capacity for thinking it in terms of my business mind and getting work done and moving on to the next project and bringing in new work is getting weaker.
It's all relative.
I'm not sure what that means because in my experience, we're talking about two good things. We're talking about my commitment to doing my practices and to being out of the rational experience and being in the expansive experience versus being the practical self of mastery which actually produces for a client or finds a new client. And those are two good things.
Two good things.
But the balance of which and the timing of which is very interesting to manage in this environment.
And
It's still mastery. Both are mastery, but they're different aspects, important aspects of ourselves.
yeah, and we're constantly seeking this thing called balance. And all that we actually know is that the tension of those two things will grow you.
Yeah.
And yet it's remarkably uncomfortable.
The teachings on education are fabulous in terms of what you're saying. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Yeah, I haven't read it for a long time, but I remember it.
But they're just spectacular. I mean, it's kind of thrilling for me to hear you speak because I love those teachings so much.
Which teachings?
Education. It's in the same volume as The Art of Personality.
Yeah, on the education of children and so on.
Right.
What does this all tell us about the maqam? That it's really relative rather than absolute? Where is it left?
That it's both stable and fluid. That it's a level of relatively sustained integration, and yet we can't step out of the tension, and we can't tell ourselves that we've finished anything. I mean, as in the example that you were using, you know, you worked on something, you achieved a certain level of mastery with it, and yeah, it's time to move on. You just don't keep beating on the thing, you know, trying to beat it into another shape. You got into the shape you needed to get into. You turn your attention elsewhere. And I think the trick is probably around this to say, I'm finished with that for now. It's time to turn my attention away for now. But if it was a true, if it was truly one of those things that we come into this life to work on, we'll probably be working on it for the rest of our lives, except that when it comes around again, we'll be working on, hopefully, a more subtle version of it. You know, I always think of it like potholes, you know, a road with potholes, and, you know, we come into this, this life with certain things that are just natural potholes for us. And in our lives, we get wounded. And those are like potholes that we fall into over and over. We step in them, we break an ankle, we trip over them. And the best that we can do is fill them in. But like any good pothole, it just keeps sinking down. And so you have to go back at it. And so I think we'll probably always dip in those spots. But do we fall in them? Or is it just a place where we dip and we go, oh, this is where I've always had trouble. There's always work to do here. And once you've stepped in it again, you'll know, oh, it's time to work on it again. But I do believe you're right also. At a certain point you work on something, and it's time you turn your attention elsewhere. But it probably will come back around, and hopefully we've achieved a level where we're dealing with it in a new problem around it, or a new level of problem around it. This will be the last one.
Okay. So I found for myself that when I address some of the issues with compassion and kindness, it's just the only way that it works.
And this brings us back to the first things, the first illustration I used in the original paradox. But yes, you know, within the Sufi tradition, just for the example of some of our meditation practices, which focus on the heart. And so, you know, what do we do when an extraneous thought comes up in the middle of a meditation in which we're meditating on the heart? And the practice is not like Buddhism to wholly ignore it or, you know, push it away, or even to ignore it or acknowledge it in the Buddhist way of saying thinking, feeling, but almost to embrace whatever comes up with the heart, but not to leave your heart focused, but to say, and my heart can accept that too. Whatever's coming up, that can be held in my heart. But what you're saying brings us back to the original paradox and the original oath that's administered to us. Be righteous and be not wicked, but even if the whole world tells you that you're righteous, you must see yourself as if you're wicked. And then the other Jewish teaching that says you must not see yourself as wicked. What does it all come to? Except that You make the attempt to be righteous and not to be wicked. But then, you can never tell yourself, I'm righteous. Because once you start telling yourself that, you're not. You become inflated in the ego and you step right out of righteousness. And this is what the teachings in the tradition say, that you can't afford to think of yourself as righteous because it's a setup. As soon as you do, you're not. And so we have to remain in this tension of not thinking of ourselves as wicked. We shouldn't, because we become depressed and sad and then don't act in the way that we should because we're too down. We're kicking ourselves when we're down. And so we have to accept ourselves. And yet, we can't either think of ourselves as righteous. It just says, be righteous, be not wicked. But we're not to think of ourselves as either righteous or wicked.
It's a balance point between the two. I call it the yoga of life. You have to push, stretch, but not so far you hurt yourself.
Yeah.
So it's balance.
So that's actually a logically resolvable paradox.
Yeah. It seems like a paradox, but there is a clear teaching here. If we accept the kind of metaphysical values that underlie it. So, just one more time, we are to be righteous and be not wicked, but we are neither to think of ourselves as wicked or righteous.